Well, good morning. I've got some good news for you guys. You know, we've been trying to build a parking lot, right? I think it's going on 2 years now, it feels like. Well, it's going to happen. Our elder board has selected a contractor, and the contracts have been signed. And so, good Lord willing, the city of St. George will be releasing permits to us this week, and construction will begin forthwith. So, anyways, thank you, Jesus. Yep. I was like, now I'm waiting for the Lord to return. So, figure, man, the two put together there. We're going to be continuing with the Jonah study that we started last week. We're going to continue with that next week. But we're going to do something a little bit different here today. And, you know, I've come to discover that in general in life, there's basically two extremes when it comes to our emotions, or emotions in general. And basically, there are people who have very little control over their emotions, all right? They wear their emotions on their sleeves, so you never have to worry about knowing how they feel, because they will show you or they will tell you how they feel in most instances. There's also people who seem to be just cold as ice, like no emotion whatsoever. And those kinds of folks are a little bit more difficult sometimes to understand and know where they're coming from. But either way, these extremes can be problematic, okay? Because those who wear their emotions on their sleeves, they may sometimes come across as emotionally frail and needy. They might come across as an emotional wreck, and that might actually push people out of their life. It might be harder to have friends, because a lot of people don't want to have all of the drama that sometimes a person wearing their emotions on their sleeves brings into the relationship, all right? But at the same time, those kinds of people that lock themselves down, sometimes we look at them and we think, ooh, they're so stoic, they're so strong. But the reality is they hold all that stress, all that angst inside of themselves. They don't betray a hint of feeling, and what ends up happening is that pent-up emotion is literally destroying them from the inside out. I know my older brother was one such person. My entire life, he just couldn't show any kind of emotion. And if somebody showed emotion around him, especially, God forbid, should they cry, he would shut that down, and he would just repeat over and over again. He'd say, it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay. And what he meant is, I'm not going to show any emotion, so I certainly don't want to see your emotion. Well, unfortunately for my brother, he passed away when he was 50 years old. And I think in part, all of that repressed emotion, I think it got the best of him. He was disease-ridden at 50 years old. Now, we don't have time to talk in depth about all the various kinds of emotions that we can experience, and I do believe that we're going to have a series coming up sometime later this in the next year, where we're going to talk about basically mental health issues. It's something that doesn't get a lot of airtime in the church these days, and we're going to probably be addressing that at some point in time in the next year. But what I would like to address today is one of our more primal emotions, which is the emotion of fear. Now, in some instances, fear can be a gift from God, right? It's the fight or flight mode. Something triggers our fear, adrenaline kicks in, and we go into self-preservation mode. And that can be a good thing. But fear can also be a bad thing. And when fear cripples us emotionally, it may cause us to not trust in God, and that would then be a bad thing. So I want to talk about this today. What exactly do we do with our fears? And I have three basic intended takeaways. First of all, I want you to understand how to pray for our fears. We want to understand how to go about that. We want to understand how to benefit from our fears, because there are benefits sometimes to fear. But we also want to understand how to deal with our fear, and that is when we actually pray our fears to God. So we want to know how to do it, why we're doing it, and we want to basically do it. And I believe that when we communicate with God about our fears, that's something very powerful, and a lot of people don't do that. So we're going to be looking at this today. Now, this morning, we're going to look at a situation in the life of the second king of Israel, King David. And David is an interesting person. Most of us know him because he's the slayer of the giant Goliath, and I think hardly a human being in the world doesn't know that David killed Goliath when he was just a teenager. That event opened the door for David to eventually join the inner circle of the first king of Israel, which was King Saul. And while David was serving Saul, he took control over Saul's military. He became a national hero. He would lead the armies of Israel into some very intense, albeit victorious, battles, and he gained the hearts of the people. And one day, after a long period of time of King Saul really constantly disappointing God, God decided that he was no longer going to allow Saul to remain as the king, and eventually he elevated King David to that status, and David served as king for 40 years. Now, the interesting thing, though, about David is that God loved him dearly. In fact, it's said of David that David was a man after God's own heart. That is the statement that God himself said about David. But David was far from perfect, okay? It might be hard for us to understand that David was a man after God's own heart when you look at some of the things that David did in his life while he was king. For one thing, at one point in time, he committed adultery with a married woman, and then in order to cover up his sin when she became pregnant, and everybody would have known that it wasn't her husband's baby, in order to protect her but not necessarily tell the truth, he had her husband put to death basically on the battlefield. They moved him up to the front lines and they said, okay, you hold it, and they pulled everybody else back. That was by David's order, and he was basically murdered by his own people at the behest of the king. And we also know that David had multiple wives, something God did not tell him to do, actually said he shouldn't do, and commanded not be done. But David had multiple wives. He had multiple concubines, and a concubine is in the eyes of the law less than a wife. It was basically a person that was kept for the purpose of sexual pleasure, and he had multiple concubines. And eventually, though, as a result of these indiscretions in his life, God pulled back his protection from King David, and God allowed him to reap the consequences of his repeated bad actions. And eventually his son Absalom, whom David loved dearly but did not get any reciprocation, Absalom hated his father. Absalom led a rebellion, and he attempted to basically overthrow and destroy King David. Now, here's the from his advisor, a man by the name of Ahithophel. And this became the policy in his life as he went out to destroy his father. So look at this with me. This is from 2 Samuel chapter 17. We read this. Ahithophel said to Absalom, I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him while he is weary and weak. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people with him will flee. I would strike down only the king and bring all the people back to you. The death of the man that you seek, again, his father, will mean the return of all. All the people will be unharmed. And this plan seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel. So he's not only doing this on his own accord, he's got his advisors on board with him, and he has the elders of Israel, the men that prior to this would have been faithful to David, but David has been abandoned pretty much by everybody. So David flees for his life, and he leaves everything behind, including his multiple wives and his concubines, and Absalom hates his father so much that he defiles all of David's wives and all of his concubines by publicly raping them up on top of the palace roof where people could see him doing this. And so this is David's darkest hour. He's losing everything that's important to him, including a son whom some people don't quite understand why, but he loved his son dearly. Even at the end of his son's life, he would have taken Absalom back over everything else. And it was an interesting scenario. So this is where we find David. This is where we find Absalom. And again, this is David's darkest hour. So what does David do in his darkest hour? Well, interestingly enough, he prays to God. And in his prayer, we can find a model for how we deal with our own fears and insecurities. So look with me over at Psalm chapter 3. We're going to read verses 1 through 8. We read this right here. A psalm of David when he fled from his son Absalom. Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him, but you, Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts my head high. I call out to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy mountain. I lie down and sleep. I wake up because the Lord sustains me. I will not fear, though tens of thousands assail me on every side. Arise, Lord, deliver me, my God. Strike all my enemies on the jaw. Break the teeth of the wicked. This is what you call an imprecatory prayer. We normally don't pray like this, right? But David did. He says, from the Lord comes deliverance. May your blessings be on your people. Now, when you read through this prayer, you kind of get the idea that David seems to be doing fairly well. You know, that in fact, you would almost maybe take away the conclusion that God is stopping all of the evil that Absalom is perpetrating against him. But the truth of the matter is, David's kind of praying the opposite of what he's experiencing in some instances. And what he's experiencing is fear. And I point this out because there are many preachers out there that will tell you that if you love God and God loves you and you have enough faith in God, that no harm will follow you in life. You know, as soon as you get in a negative situation, you go to God with your prayers, and God's going to brush aside all the sorrows near immediately. You just got to have enough faith. Well, David had faith in God. He really, truly did. And in his prayer here, he could have really laid it thick. And on the line, he summed things up kind of nicely. But we know when we read the rest of the story that long before it got better, it got far worse. And David experienced just near devastating emotional collapse at times. And so he suffered tremendously before the time came that God restored him back to his throne. So what we kind of see here is David is afraid, but he is declaring to God that he will not fear. He's declaring to God that even though tens of thousands would assail him on every side, that he's not going to sit there and be captivated by fear. And this event kind of reminds me of an admonition that we have in the New Testament, and we quote this often around here, and probably should do even more so. But in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7, Peter said, cast all your anxiety on him, on Christ, because he cares for you. So this is what David is doing. He's casting his anxieties on God because he knows that he is a care that concerns God. So what do we see here that David does? Well, first of all, he talks to God about his fear, all right? David talks to God about his fear. And I would encourage all of us to do this as well. There's nothing that you can't talk to God about. You can sit down with God at any point in time and have a conversation and tell God what it is that you are experiencing. And one of the reasons that I believe this is so important is because in the book of James, we are told you have not because you ask not. So a lot of people make these assumptions, well, God knows what I need. God knows that I'm afraid. God knows the difficult circumstances I'm going through. But they never sit down in prayer and talk through their circumstances and their feelings with God. And if this is something that you've never done, I would encourage you to do it. And if you think to yourself, like, oh, God's got too much going on, he doesn't need to hear that. Well, he told us to cast all our anxiety upon him because we are a care that concerns him. That's what David did. He said, Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? Many are even saying, God will not deliver him. He's even telling God what the people were saying about God as if God didn't know what people were saying. But God did know, and Dave's still having the conversation with them anyway. And not only does he declare his circumstances to God, he also expresses his ultimate trust in God for deliverance. He said, From the Lord comes deliverance. May your blessings be on your people. Now, the reality for the child of God is that God is always going to deliver us, one way or another. Now, we would like to see the deliverance as quickly as possible, in our lifetime, maybe within days of the difficulty coming, we talk to God and we want to see His deliverance. I've been around long enough as a follower of Jesus Christ to know that oftentimes the deliverance that we seek doesn't come in this life. The ultimate deliverance happens when we depart from this life and we go to be with God for all eternity. And then we have the added promise that we're actually going to get brand new bodies someday, immortal bodies like unto the body that Christ Himself now possesses. So here's another thing that David does as he's talking to God. He talks to himself, declaring God's truth to himself. There is nothing wrong with telling yourself God's truth. In fact, if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, and I don't suppose that all of you are yet, I hope that one day all of you will be followers of Jesus Christ, but if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, you should tell yourself God's truth regularly. We call it preaching the gospel to yourself. So in verses 3 through 6, let me read this back to you. He said, "But you, Lord, you are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts my head high." And then he says, "I call out to the Lord, and He answers me from His holy mountain." Here he is talking to himself. "I lie down and sleep. I wake up again because the Lord sustains me. I will not fear, though tens of thousands assail me on every side." Now, I bet that if you really saw David in that moment, I bet he was having some sleepless nights. I bet he was afraid. I bet he was a little paranoid. But he's talking to God about God's truth, and he's talking to himself about God's truth, and he's preaching that gospel to himself. Now, he goes on and talks about God being a shield. And I want to spend a little bit of time on this right here. Back in David's day, there were basically two kinds of shields that a soldier would go into battle with. Now, one of those shields was, I almost brought the lid of a trash can in here because it was basically like an old-fashioned trash can lid. It was round, and it had a handle on the inside, maybe even a little brace where you would kind of put your arm through it and hold onto it. And that was a shield that you would take with you into close quarters, hand-to-hand combat. It was there to take the blows of swords and spears that were being thrust at you from right in front of you. Now, there was another kind of shield, though, that would be utilized in those circumstances. It was a much larger shield. It was basically the size of a small door, and somebody else would hold the shield. You had a shield bearer. So you would sit there with your little shield on your arm and your sword in your hand, but you would also have this armor bearer who basically held this big shield, and he would turn it towards whatever danger was coming your way. And it protected you pretty much if it was held correctly, and if you crouched correctly, it would protect you from your feet all the way up to your head. And this was the kind of shield that would be used when you were laying siege to a city. So while the troops are advancing on the city, the armor bearer is holding this big shield up, and people from inside the walls of the city, they're tossing stuff down, they're shooting arrows, they're throwing spears, and maybe even dropping rocks and stuff. And that shield protected you so that you could get up close to the city and eventually breach the walls or the gates of the city. That is the kind of shield that David had in mind when he says that God is our shield. So basically, I want you to note this. Symbolically, God is our shield in the fight, okay? Not a shield from the fight. All right, he's our shield in the fight, okay? A shield, this shield would serve no purpose other than a wall decoration when you're not in the fight. But when you're in the fight, it serves a purpose. So in order to experience the shield, you have to be in the fight. Now, I've been through a great many trials in my life. Some trials that I had control over, some trials I had no control over, as in the case with my first wife who came down with melanoma cancer and eventually succumbed to it. I didn't have any control over that situation. But there's other times I'm no different than any of you because of my own bad decisions or sinful actions. I can bring trials my way. I can bring negative consequences my way. Newsflash, preachers aren't perfect, okay? You're not perfect. I'm not perfect. Thank God for His grace because we all need it all of the time. But, sometimes we bring trials upon ourselves. David did. This was a totally unnecessary trial that he's experiencing. God is allowing him to reap the consequences of his poor decisions and sinful actions over the course of years of service as the king. And so that's what he was experiencing there. But I can tell you, though, I know for a fact, no matter how the trial comes about, whether you brought it on yourself or have no control over it whatsoever, God does not leave us in the midst of our hardships. I've discovered, though, that no matter how much faith we have, if it is His desire to take us through that trial, He is going to take us through the trial. And no amount of faith is going to shorten the trial or cause it to completely go away. God is going to do what God is going to do. But the cool thing, again, is that we can know that no matter how difficult things get for us in the midst of these trials that we go through, God is our shield in the fight from the beginning to the end. Now, on that note, I want to just turn a little bit, and I want to have a discussion about the current crisis that we are experiencing in literally the entire world today. It seems like we just can't catch our breath. For the last couple of years, every time you turn around, it's something else, right? Well, now what we are experiencing, in some places it's worse than it is here, but we're seeing another economic downturn in this world, and a lot of people are freaking out. You got inflation is out of control. I mean, the stock market's an absolute mess. Don't even look at it, all right? Listen to Dave Ramsey, Financial Peace University guru. Don't look at it. Just don't even think about it. Don't look at it. Let it do what it's going to do. That's what Dave says. Just ignore it. I'm not giving you financial advice, but if you want to sleep tonight, don't look at the stock market, right? Just don't look at it. Sleep is too important. But I mean, fuel, I drive a diesel truck. That thing is parked in the garage, getting dusty. I don't even want to look at it. I'm afraid every time I look at it, it's going to cost me more money in fuel. But food, I cannot believe what has happened to food prices. Think about that. Just fuel, food, and construction supplies alone have easily doubled. In the case of construction equipment, I mean, are you kidding me? A $2 2x4 is still like $7, down from probably 11 or 12, so at least it's moving in the right direction. But these things they're kind of scary. And I mean, if that's not bad enough, what? Monkeypox? Are you kidding me? Monkeypox. All right? By the way, if you have your smallpox vaccine like I do from 1 billion years ago, supposedly that protects you from the monkeypox. But now we got that monkeypox out there, and boy, you don't think the media is going to leverage that for all it's worth to scare the living daylights out of you? Trust me, they're going to. They already are. And so there's a lot of people out there wondering, like, what in the world is going on in the world? Is it all going to crash and burn? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe it's all going to start getting better next week. Maybe it's going to get worse. I know that God knows what's going to happen. I love that phrase. It never occurred to you. Nothing ever occurs to God. Well, God's not up in heaven going, oh my goodness, what did I do? I turned for 1 second, and now we got monkeypox, right? No. I don't know what's going to happen, but any reasonable person can see the economic storm clouds in front of our faces. And it's going to be interesting to see. I'm not being political, but it's going to be interesting to see what happens in politics in the next 2 election cycles, because the number one concern right now of people in America that are going to be voting in the upcoming elections is the economy. Because you can't escape it. Every time you drive past a gas station every day, it's like 4 cents higher, 2 cents higher, 6 cents higher. And it almost seems like they all have the same price, too. I'm just saying, I'm kind of wondering what's going on with that one, unless you're near the highway. By the way, don't fill up your vehicle near the highway. Everybody knows that. Don't do it, okay? Go to the Mavericks in the center of town, or any gas station. I don't want to. Somebody might own a gas station here, and I don't want to make a negative statement about, Fabulous Freddy's, whatever. You go to your favorite place. But people are concerned, and what do we do with this kind of fear? Well, I think we learn from King David, and I think that we, just as he praised his fears to God, you and I should do the same thing. We should learn how to pour out our hearts to God, as he commanded us to, by the way, and we grab a hold of God in these difficult times, and we go with him for the ride of our life. Now, what this means to me is that we all need to move forward, okay, in the face of all of these financial uncertainties and difficulties and monkeypox and whatever, but we need to do it with a faith wherein we trust that God knows what is best for us, and that he will protect us from anything that does not serve his purposes or our good. Now, the downside of that statement is, if you got difficulties going on in your life right now, then God's okay with that. He checked that off and said, yes, I'm going to let you experience these difficulties. That doesn't mean that he is not your shield. That means that for a time in your life, he has a purpose for allowing something to transpire in your existence. In this case, in all of our existence. But God knows our struggle. And that means that instead of curling up in a corner and freaking out about what might happen to us financially, what we need to do is something in the opposite direction that's going to actually help us out. And so here's what I would suggest to you. In a time of fear, go to God for wisdom, okay? And we get his wisdom from his word, by the way. Don't go to God looking for special revelation. You're not going to get it, all right? He gave you the Bible, so read his Bible. You want wisdom? Read the book of Proverbs. You want to know how to lean on God when you're going through the struggles of life and you need his strength? Read through the Psalms. Read the book of James in the New Testament. It's a wisdom book. It's filled with wisdom. But go to God for wisdom and put together a plan of action, and then move forward to accomplish that plan. Now, I have never been a let go and let God kind of person. To be honest with you, I believe that is bad theology. Just my opinion. I don't believe in it. I would prefer to say grab a hold of God and go for the ride of your life. I think that letting go and letting God is, in my opinion, I think it's an abdication of personal responsibility. God wants us to be responsible. He wants us to develop wise plans from his word, from the wisdom of wise people, so that we're not caught off guard in the difficulties of life. So if you go on and look at King David's life, you look at the rest of the story, you realize that that's exactly what David did, okay? He devised a plan that carried him through his difficult circumstances. He didn't let go and let God. He prayed to God and grabbed a hold of God and went for the ride of his life through the most difficult circumstances that most people can imagine. And so what we discover is that, again, while he understood that God was his shield, he was still continuously moving about and making wise decisions. He was trying to move in the opposite direction of the army that was there to destroy him. And so he had a plan. He was planning wisely, and he was adapting God's wisdom to his circumstances and doing what he could to survive the struggle, which is what God calls us to do. So God is our shield. But how do we put in action, how do we put a plan of action together instead of caving into fear? Well, the simple answer, I think, for our day and age, like what we're experiencing right now, we need a financial game plan. Every person should be developing a financial game plan. And there's several components to that. First of all, building a budget. Building a budget. You want to assign every dollar a destination. I really like that phrase. Sitting down, looking at the resources you have on hand, and assigning a destination for every single dollar, all right? And then trying to live with that thought in mind of how you're going to spend the money in the budget that you develop. But developing an emergency account. So where and when you can save money, like right now, what do we know? We know gasoline is near double. It's probably going to double before the end of summer. They say it could be as high as $6 a gallon on average. That's another $1.30 or $1.40 a gallon. We're not even talking diesel. We're just talking regular old gasoline. But when you think about it, what used to be maybe $300-$400 a month in the average family's budget is now probably $700 to $800 a month. Well, a lot of families look at that and like, what are we going to do? But they don't adjust anything else that they're doing in the way that they're spending money. And I'll say more about that in a minute. But, we want to have an emergency account so that when things like this happen, we're in a better position with our bottom line. Now, if you're trying to establish an emergency account right now, that's a little bit more difficult. It's not impossible. And there's some resources out there I'll talk about before we close today that will help you. But we want to determine, again, what we're going to give to God. We should always put God first, make God the God of our finances. And our church does that so well. It was just not that long ago, we shared with you guys, we were like $41,000 behind in giving. And now, as of last weekend, we're only $515, I think, behind in giving with the end of the fiscal year coming up. And so we are very fortunate to have people that trust God with their finances. So I'm not giving you this talk because we're trying to make up $515. I'm giving this talk because I want to say, I think we see in this congregation that a lot of you do make God the God of your finances, and God provides for His church. He provides for His people, but putting God first is so important. But then do everything you can to pay off debt. A good friend of mine used to have a financial business. They did loans, and in the 2008 housing market crunch crisis, they ended up losing their business because people stopped borrowing money. So they ended up departing out of that business. But one time, this woman told me, she said, the reason people are losing their houses has nothing to do with the houses. It has to do with the garage. She said it's the trailers, the toys, the side-by-sides. It's all the massive amount of debt that people have incurred during the good times, but now here come the bad times, and they've got all of this debt, so what are you supposed to do? Now, I can tell you, as long as I can remember, I have always had on file some sort of budget that I update regularly. I like to use Excel spreadsheet. Other people, there's apps and things like that you can use. But I'm a believer in the budget, and that budget is where you assign, every dollar a destination. And I've actually found it to be an extremely helpful tool to get control of the finances. And it's actually a very biblical concept. But unfortunately, do you know that the majority of Americans do not have a budget? And if the statistics are true, the majority of you don't have a budget. And I'm not picking on you, but if you don't have a budget going into a very difficult financial period of time, that's you don't know the state of your troops, right? You don't know what to expect and where to pivot and what to adjust. And that's why a lot of people are freaking out during this difficult time. People are afraid that they're not going to have the money to put gas in their car and put food on their table for their family. And that, again, that's where a budget can come in helpful, because truth be told, most of us actually have more money than we think we have. If we spent our money wisely, it would actually go much further. And so if every single one of us, if we would actually sit down and write out a budget, write out two budgets, write out a budget that shows you where you are spending your money. Just go look at all the expenses you make, start tracking. How much am I spending on gas? How much am I spending on food? How much am I spending on clothes? How much am I spending on hair? How much am I spending on eating out on a weekly or monthly basis? But look where you're actually spending, and then sit down with the eyes of wisdom and say, where can I save money? Man, I know families that easily spend over $1,000 a month
on eating out. I mean, you take a family, mom and dad, and even 3 or 4 kids, and take a trip to McDonald's. It's $50, $60 at least, 70 or 80. You know, if you get and when we're constantly doing that, when we're constantly spending money like that, well, that could be money where we go, you know, it's cheaper to eat at home. It's not always as fun. But we cut back, maybe say, cut your eating out budget in half. Now you got money to cover the extra gasoline costs, okay? Or extra grocery costs that you're incurring because everything is so much more expensive. And so these are things that we can do, and they will make a difference in the long run. And I can tell you, you know, even in our household, we're trying to do these exercises, you know? I mean, I'm trying to figure out, hey, how can we combine trips? So instead of driving, you know, multiple vehicles all over the place, is there a way to like limit that, you know, not run to the store every single day? I mean, my goodness, if I jump in my truck and I run to Lynn's supermarket from my house, it's costing me $6 because I'm burning at least a gallon of gas between the two locations. So I'm trying to figure out a way not to travel as much. But these are things that can save us money. The fact of the matter is, we all need to think strategically and practice God's wisdom. And I think you get the idea here. Trust God. He is your shield, right? Develop and abide by a budget, but spend your money wisely. And if you do need more help with this, we actually, outside in the lobby, we've put together some paper budgets. You can take them home with you and fill in the numbers. Personally, I like spreadsheets because you don't have to erase anything. You can just retype it or create another page. But we even have a website, and that website is smccutah.org/peace plan, and that's in your bulletin where the sermon notes are. There are several things at that location that will help you, including some connections to Financial Peace University podcast and things like that. But there's apps out there, there's budget sheets out there. We just wanted to give you some things to help you. But the important thing is, don't stay paralyzed in fear. Instead, make a plan and then work your plan while you trust God all along the way. And that is wisdom. And that is the antidote for fear. And the final thought here is the last thing David did in this scenario is he relocated his identity in the glory of God. And we see this in Psalm 3, verse 3. Reading it again, he said, "But you, Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts my head high." So while our band's coming to close down the service, here's the deal. The circumstances that surrounded David challenged all the things that he gloried in throughout his life, all the things that he looked to give him a sense of pride in self. And all those things were crashing down all around him. You know, he was no longer the king in charge of Israel. He was exposed as a bad father. He was not as loved by the people as he thought he was because they abandoned him for his son Absalom. And what he did is he went to the only thing he really had left, which was God, and a handful of friends around him, and he expresses his confidence in God. He relocates his source of importance, his meaning and purpose to God. He draws his identity from God. And eventually, David was restored to his position as king. But the lessons that he learned during that difficult time, they were invaluable. But the reason that he learned those lessons is because he took his fears to God. And that's what I want to encourage all of you to do. Cast all of your cares upon God because he cares for you. And I want to pray for you guys right now. So here's what I'd like you to do. I want you to think about that thing that's causing you fear right now. You know, maybe it is monkeypox. Maybe it's your finances. I don't know what it is. But I want you to think about whatever it is that's causing you fear right now. And I just kind of want you to hold that up, all right? And I'm going to pray for you. And I'm going to pray for that fear, praying for all of us collectively. Father in heaven, thank you so much for the fact that you are our shield. You protect us in ways that we can't even begin to understand. There's no evil that will befall us and do harm to us, but that you already know of. And nothing will come upon us that you have not personally allowed. And so we know that in all of the difficulties of life, you are working together in our midst. You are working for us to produce an even greater good. Now, Father, all around this room, people are thinking about the thing that is causing them that fear right now. And they're holding that up before you. And God, I don't know if you're going to take that fear away. I don't know if you're just going to provide grace and strength and mercy to each person in these difficult times. But I know you're going to do something. I know you are doing something. So as we hold up these fears before you, Father, be our strength. Don't let these fears become a crushing blow over us, but help us to trust you with our fears, to carry these fears towards you, even in a difficult time where we don't know what's going to continue happening in the world, in our economy, even with monkeypox and things like that. God, we know that you got a plan, and we know that all things eventually are going to work according to your plan. And if the worst thing that happens to us in this world is that we have to leave this world and go be with you, then that's actually a pretty good thing. So, God, we just trust you, and we lift up your kingdom, your purposes, and we just pray for one another, and we pray for your strength and courage. We pray these things in Christ's name. Amen. God bless you guys.